In the early 1960s, Saddleworth Moor, northwest of Manchester, became the scene of perhaps the most infamous series of crimes in British history: the Moors murders. In May 1966, young lovers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were convicted of savagely killing 2 children and a teenager and burying 2 of their bodies in this hostile wilderness. Most murder stories end when the culprits are captured and imprisoned. Not the Moors murders. With the death penalty abolished just months before, Brady and Hindley became Britain's first serial killers to spend their lives behind bars. Over the next 50 years, a twisted dance played out as the pair attempted to exploit and manipulate both the prison system and each other, leading to attempted prison breaks, the grotesque manipulation of victims' families, and the appalling revelation of even more murders.
I've come to believe that in order to understand how this case has retained its grim fascination, you need to look more closely at what happened to the notorious couple after they were imprisoned. This is my journey into the dark and often bizarre aftermath of Britain's most shocking crime.
My name's Mark Billingham, author of the Tom Thorne series, and I've written 23 crime novels. Although I write crime fiction, several of my books are based on real-life crimes. One crime above all others has haunted my imagination for decades and has influenced at least 2 of my books: the Moors murders. The Moors murders forever imprinted the names of an infamous couple on the national psyche: Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. One of the reasons the story weighs so heavily on my mind is the strangest letter I have ever received. It's handwritten from Ian Brady himself, sent to me in 2005.
I was researching a different documentary at the time and wrote to Brady requesting an interview. I wasn't expecting a reply, but I got one. It's largely a selection of random complaints and grievances from Brady, bearing almost no relevance to the interview, which never happened, by the way. I've never forgotten this letter, but now I've come to realise that I'm far from alone in receiving correspondence from this infamous killer.
During their lifetimes, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley generated an astonishing amount of correspondence and documentation. Whether letters, prison reports, or newspaper articles. I believe that only by following this trail of evidence will the unresolved questions in this case finally be answered. Was Hindley a willing participant in these hideous crimes, or was she, as she claimed, an unwilling accomplice?
She was the facilitator. I mean, small children don't go off with strange men, so because she was picking up the children, she was facilitating it.
How were the pair allowed to continually taunt the police and torment their victims' families from behind bars?
There's a part of him that believed he was of great importance and was above other human beings.
And the biggest question of all:
will the body of Keith Bennett, the last remaining victim buried on the moors, ever be discovered?
We have reasonable suspicion that there's documents there in someone's possession that might identify the location of human remains.
To explain how Brady and Hindley came to stand trial for serial child murder, I'm meeting Jean Ritchie, Myra Hindley's biographer. It's a story that begins in Manchester in 1961.
She was a shorthand typist and she took a job with the company, Millwards, where he was working as a clerk. She was very, very young and very, very impressed by a man who was very different from anyone she'd ever met before. He was very into classical music, obscure films, everything that she wasn't as a working-class girl from a working-class area of Manchester.
The couple became lovers, but what 18-year-old Hindley couldn't have known was that 23-year-old Brady was a psychopath who harboured murderous desires. He read books on perverted sexuality by the Marquis de Sade and studied Nazi ideology. He persuaded Hindley to join a gun club so they could procure weapons, and gradually he began to reveal his darker side.
They had kinky sex, we know that from the photographs. She knew he was kinky. She knew that things were not normal. And I think gradually he realised that she would not only go along with being involved in his Nazi cult, but also in this other thing that he had, which involved murder.
2 years into their warped relationship, Brady convinced Hindley that the only way to reach what German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called the supreme pleasure would be to commit rape and murder. The first victim they were convicted of killing was 12-year-old John Kilbride. In the early evening of the 23rd of November 1963, Brady and Hindley offer 12-year-old John Kilbride a lift home. Reassured by the smiling Hindley, the boy accepts the lift. But instead of taking him home, they take John Kilbride up onto Saddleworth Moor. When they reach the moor, Brady leads Kilbride into the wilderness while Hindley waits in the car. Brady sexually assaults the boy, then murders him. Then together, he and Hindley bury the body. The second victim they were convicted of killing was 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. She was abducted by the couple at a fun fair on Boxing Day 1964, stripped and forced to pose for pornographic photos before being raped and killed. She too was buried on the moors.
The crime that finally sees Brady and Hindley arrested is the murder of 17-year-old Edward Evans. On October the 6th, 1965, Brady picks up Evans in Manchester, brings him back to the house he shares with Hindley, and invites a mutual friend, David Smith, over to join them. Then, bizarrely, in front of Smith, Brady brutally murders Edward Evans with a hatchet.
Brady had hoped that his friend Smith would join his and Hindley's murderous cult. But instead, Smith, terrified that he would become Brady and Hindley's next victim, went straight to the police. Brady and Hindley were arrested and stood trial for 3 killings: 17-year-old Edward Evans, 12-year-old John Kilbride, and 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. The trial was a global media sensation. Both pled not guilty. Brady tried to protect his lover.
Ian Brady, of course, tried to exonerate Myra Hindley, and he tried to make it out that everything was to do with him, to suggest she was just his dupe, his acolyte, an accessory, not a prime mover in this.
Brady's efforts to shield Hindley proved to be in vain. On May the 6th, 1966, he was found guilty of all 3 murders, and Hindley guilty of 2. Unlike their victims, the couple escaped with their lives. Just months earlier, at the end of 1965, the death penalty had been abolished in England. Instead, Brady and Hindley were sent to separate prisons, she to Holloway, he to Durham. And this, for me, is where the most grimly fascinating part of the story actually begins.
On the face of it, the justice system has done its job. It's apprehended and imprisoned a pair of heinous serial killers. But in the dark and twisted tale of the Moors murders, that's only the beginning of the story.
What plays out from here is a twisted game between two of Britain's most notorious serial killers, who for half a century from behind bars were allowed to manipulate the establishment, taunt the police, and worst of all, to torment their victims' families. On the one side, Ian Brady's sickening attempts to maintain control of the story versus Myra Hindley's desperate efforts to gain redemption. All of it played out against the backdrop of the secrets they have yet to divulge, the depraved murders of 2 other children, and the whereabouts of their bodies on Saddleworth Moor. This is the beginning of the Moors murders' dark aftermath. It's 1966, and Moors murderers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley have been imprisoned for the savage killing of 3 children. But the grisly aftermath of the Moors murders, the twisted game Brady and Hindley would continue to play from behind bars, has only just begun. It's a story that's documented here, at the National Archives in southwest London, where all Brady and Hindley's prison records are housed, many of them never seen on television before.
I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of folders such as this, full of bits of evidence, photo albums such as this one. And that's what makes the case so compelling. There are so many lines of inquiry, so many trails of evidence leading off in 100 different directions.
To help me try and make sense of this vast paper trail is Dr. Tom Clark of Sheffield University. Tom has studied the prison records extensively. The files chart the behaviours and attitudes of Brady and Hindley towards each other after they entered the prison system.
When they enter the prison system, they are incredibly close. They're writing letters to each other on a very regular basis. Their relationship is incredibly strong. One of the things that you can find in the archive are the contact logs. And this is where you can see that they're constantly requesting to visit each other.
Incredibly, even once they'd been incarcerated, the Moors murderers held out hope they could be physically reunited.
At one point in the log, Hindley asks one of the prison officers what would happen if she married Brady.
So what I've got in front of me here is a report from a senior prison welfare officer from December 1969, by which time Brady had been in prison for 3 years. It says, she is, quote, everything to him. He has vigorously campaigned for his visiting rights with Myra. So it's clear that at this time, he still views Myra as his partner in crime and is starting a concerted campaign for her to be allowed to visit, for conjugal visits, which, when you think about it, is completely bizarre and something that's clearly never, ever going to happen.
Denied the company of Hindley, Brady declines the company of anyone. Brady couldn't bear the denial of visits to Hindley because it was a threat to his control over her. And control, for Brady, was everything. To explore this side of Brady's psyche, I'm in London to meet someone with a first-hand insight into his manipulative personality. Jeremy Coyd is a former forensic psychiatrist who in March 2003 conducted a face-to-face psychiatric assessment of Ian Brady.
I haven't met anybody quite his extreme in terms of his level of psychopathy. He was very powerful in terms of his effect on others. This was dealing with a man with a particular psychopathic personality. He wanted to control everything. During the interview, he essentially didn't allow me to ask him many questions. He just wanted to say what he had to say. Most of the time, he was effectively controlling me, and he was delivering a lecture. I realised that the man does actually have a power. Control was of the essence, which is what he's always done, and manipulation.
Denied access to Hindley, Brady attempted to control his new environment the only way he could, by self-isolating in his cell. For his first 6 years in prison, Brady's only outlet was his frequent correspondence with Hindley. They dreamed of meeting again and peppered their letters with secret code. But after 4 years in prison, Brady's worst nightmare was about to materialise. Hindley was starting to slip away.
Hindley enters Holloway, and Holloway is going through something of a huge transformation in terms of how it's working with prisoners. And it's a much more progressive regime. And what begins to happen is that Hindley basically begins to make a life for herself in this prison.
She soon established friends, and she actually had, as good as it gets, a life in prison. He was in solitary confinement, going slowly madder and madder, and she wanted less and less to do with him.
Myra Hindley was abandoning Ian Brady. But no one could have foreseen the momentous consequences this would have.
She rejected him. She stopped writing to him. She wanted nothing more to do with him.
By 1972, after 6 years in prison, the relationship between these two serial child killers was entering a new, even more poisonous phase. Hindley's letters to Brady became fewer and further between, and there was an astonishing reason for it. She had dumped him for a prison guard called Patricia Cairns.
Patricia Cairns was very popular with all the prisoners. She would always bring you in a packet of Benson and Hedges if she could, smuggle it in. And she and Myra started an affair in the prison. It was a very passionate relationship, physical insofar as you can be physical within the constraints of a prison. They would meet in the church, and they would meet in the chapel, they would meet in other places.
These handwritten letters from Myra Hindley have never been seen on camera before. They were ostensibly sent by Hindley to her cousin, but in fact, they were meant for her lover.
The letters would be sent on to her friend Carol's flat, where Patricia Cairns, who obviously lived outside the prison, would go and read the letters.
So what does her relationship with Patricia Cairns tell us about Myra, do you think?
Patricia Cairns was again, under the spell of Myra Hindley, as many, many prisoners were over the years, completely under her spell. This has turned from her being Brady's acolyte to her being absolutely the queen bee.
Typically, Hindley had an ulterior motive for this relationship. It was more than mere sexual gratification. She persuaded Cairns to help her plan an unlikely jailbreak.
They planned the escape. It involved taking impressions of keys, and these impressions were smuggled out to Patricia Cairns by another prisoner. Patricia Cairns actually had a passport in the name of Myra Spencer or something. They were planned to escape and live in South America happily ever after for the rest of their lives.
So this is the last letter, and it ends, "Good night, God bless for now, much love and prayers, Myra." How did their relationship end?
They were arrested for plotting to get Myra out of prison, and Patricia Cairns was given a 6-year sentence.
News of this affair was devastating for Brady. His reaction is recorded in this 1972 letter discussing a bookmark that Hindley had sent Brady as a gift.
It's written by a senior prison welfare officer who says, "Re Myra Hindley, the governor has given permission for the enclosed bookmarker to be sent to you as Brady asked that this be returned to Myra. It is obviously a symbolic gesture, meaning the relationship is at an end." So, this is 6 years after they were sent to prison, 11 years after they met, and their love affair is over. But the story of their relationship has an awfully long way to go.
Feeling that she was free from Brady's influence, Hindley underwent a transformation in Holloway Prison in the 1970s.
She went back to her Catholic religion. She became very much a leader in prison, and she had her acolytes around her, and she developed a very active lesbian life.
Hindley increasingly spun the narrative that she had only ever been an unwilling participant in Brady's murderous games. And it wasn't just the girls on the wing that Hindley charmed. Lord Longford, a Labour politician, legal reformer and fellow Catholic, also came under her spell.
Longford would visit long-term prisoners, and he would go and try and kind of make their conditions better. He visits Hindley, and they strike up a relationship.
Longford became convinced that Hindley had reformed and argued that after 10 years in prison, she should be released.
I would say that whatever she had done, she would be entitled to be considered for parole.
Hindley's original sentence stipulated a minimum of 25 years in prison before she'd be eligible for parole. So, come 1985, with Longford's support, Hindley was perhaps no more than 5 years from release. Watching on from his cell in Durham, Brady seethed at Hindley's transformation and, more importantly, her rejection of him. Worst of all for Brady were Hindley's claims that she was an unwilling participant in the murders.
She hoped to be just his accomplice. That's what she wanted the world to see her as, a duped accomplice, not a full participant.
Desperate to derail Hindley's parole campaign, in 1985, Brady makes a stunning confession.
The 3 victims he and Hindley were convicted of killing in 1966 were not the only ones. He's confessing to 2 more murders, that of 12-year-old Keith Bennett and 16-year-old Pauline Reade. And both those bodies, he tells the police, are buried out here on the moors.
Moore's murderers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley are both serving life sentences for the sadistic killings of 3 children. By the end of the 1970s, Hindley hopes her reformed image might win her parole. But Brady is determined to scupper Hindley's plans. And in 1985, he's confessed to the murders of 2 more children. 2 more children whose bodies remain buried on Saddleworth Moor. Pauline Reade and Keith Bennett had gone missing in 1963.
The children were lured into the car by Myra Hindley, then taken up onto the moors with Brady in tow. Once there, they were sexually assaulted, murdered, and buried. The difference, though, is that whereas at the original trial, Brady was doing everything he could to absolve Hindley from blame, now he was saying that she was every bit as involved as he was, that she was entirely implicated.
In 1987, the police began searching for 2 more bodies buried on the moors. I'm meeting journalist Brendan Pittaway, who was working as a reporter in Manchester at the time. Brendan corresponded with Brady in these letters that until now have never been examined on television. In them, Brady discusses the motivations for his confession.
Brady was a character who, as the writing betrays, was a very controlled and very controlling individual. He was fully aware of the impact of the murders on the public consciousness. He refers to the false stories which have been printed about him, which he is determined to try and correct.
The story that he wanted to put right above all others was Hindley's claim that she had been his unwilling accomplice.
That's one of the shocking things that comes over in the letters, where he describes the killing of Leslie and Downey and says very clearly this was Myra Hindley's doing.
He says Myra Hindley had committed physical and lesbian assaults on Pauline Reade and Leslie Ann Downey, insisting on killing the latter with her own hands by use of a silk cord. He was determined to try and scupper those parole attempts. He describes one 30,000 word parole submission as a pack of lies.
Brady's not making this confession because he's trying to clear his conscience or, God forbid, he's trying to do the right thing. He's doing this because, once again, he's trying to exert control over Hindley.
Hindley could sense the damage Brady's confession was doing to her reformed image. So she took the only option open to her and immediately confessed to her intimate involvement in not just the 2 new killings, but also the original 3. And in December 1986, she returned to the moors to help police locate 2 new graves.
A small group, including Myra Hindley, then inspected the peat slopes, all wearing balaclavas, making it almost impossible to detect which was prisoner, which armed guard.
She wanted very much to find those two bodies. She did her absolute best because she saw it as part of her ticket to one day getting out of prison.
Not wanting to be outdone, in July 1987, Brady also made a return to the moors.
Brutal child killer Ian Brady left Saddleworth Moor just over an hour ago. The 48-year-old murderer had been brought under armed guard to the site where he and his evil lover Myra Hindley buried the tortured bodies of their child victims almost a quarter of a century ago.
When he arrived on the moors, he describes having been almost corralled into an area of moorland with media looking on and almost being stage managed by police. And that wasn't to his liking. And therefore he did all he could, it seems, to almost frustrate the efforts.
Brady was no help whatsoever to the police search.
It's about power, isn't it? I mean, he'd had everything materially taken away from him. The only power he's got left is hanging on to information, which he may or may not have had.
And certainly in terms of his controlling his public image, and certainly in terms of trying to make sure that Myra Hindley was not released, there is that control, there is that power.
With Hindley's help, on July the 1st, 1987, the remains of Pauline Reade were finally found. But as this letter in the National Archives shows, the damage done to Hindley's parole efforts was beyond repair.
What I've got here is a letter from the then Home Secretary Leon Britton to the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, in which he's talking about the parole board. At present, I have in mind a tariff of 30 years for Hindley and 40 years for Brady. But then Margaret Thatcher has scribbled on the top of this letter, I do not think that either of these prisoners should ever be released from custody. Their crime was the most hideous and cruel in modern times. Now, I don't know whether it's unprecedented, but I don't think too many prime ministers have intervened that personally in this process.
The intervention of the Prime Minister showed just how high profile the issue of Hindley's parole still was, even 20 years after the crimes. Amid this never-ending media obsession, it would have been political suicide to allow Hindley's release. Brady had won his victory. But at what cost? While Hindley's campaign for parole lay in tatters, Brady was about to be declared criminally insane. And to rub salt into his wound, Hindley was about to release a bombshell of correspondence through her solicitor describing the brutal treatment she allegedly suffered at Brady's hands.
Here, at last, is the list of abuses perpetrated against me by Brady. She says he raped me, and whilst doing so began strangling me until I nearly passed out. I tried to fight him off strangling me, but the more I did, the more the pressure increased. Before leaving, he warned me that if I ever tried to get away again, I'd be the sorriest person alive.
It's not hard to imagine Brady being capable of such brutality. But Hindley's claims that she was completely dominated by her lover are now hotly disputed.
She wasn't obedient to Brady. There are people who heard her being extremely rude to Brady, and you know, she could be very scathing with him. If she was just an acolyte, that would not be the case.
What Hindley could not deny was that she played a key role in luring the victims.
She was the facilitator. I mean, small children don't go off with strange men, so because she was picking up the children, she was facilitating it.
But the most damning evidence against Hindley was contained in the trophies Brady kept of their original killings. Discovered before their trial in a suitcase filled with mementos of their murders was a tape recording the couple made of the torture and killing of their fourth victim, Leslie Ann Downey.
By all accounts, the tape recording of the killing of Leslie Ann Downey that was played in court was utterly horrific. As the terrified girl pleads for her mother, Hindley can be heard telling her to shut up or she'll slap her, telling her to stop spitting out the gag in her mouth. Hindley always claimed to have been an unwilling accomplice, but the tape shows her to have been an active participant. Without playing her role, no child dies.
It's Hindley's part in the Moors murders luring these young children to their deaths, that has given this story such horrible, enduring power.
If Ian Brady had committed these crimes with a male accomplice, the two of them would now be a footnote in an encyclopedia of true crime. We would not be talking about them here today.
Perhaps the only thing Ian Brady feared more than becoming a footnote was losing his sanity. But by the end of the 1980s, the years of solitary confinement had pushed him to the edge of outright madness.
He's spending a lot of his time in his cell playing out a role play, really, between himself, the Home Secretary and the prison governor. Brady's having arguments with himself and moving around the room and talking as if he's the prison governor and then answering in his own voice.
And it's not just his own voice that Ian Brady could hear in his cell.
He was also believed to be tormented by screams that he heard in his cell. Most likely the screams of his victims, I would have thought.
By the end of the 1980s, no one could be sure how many phantoms Ian Brady was haunted by. In this letter to journalist Brendan Pittaway, written in 1989, Brady made another astonishing claim, that he had committed a further 4 murders.
In the letters, he details other killings, 4 other killings. He says, the 2 murders I told them of committed in Manchester. He went on to say, I wrote a statement to the Strathclyde police re the murder in Glasgow and the second above Loch Long.
And you went to the police with this information?
Absolutely. I spoke to a senior officer at Strathclyde Police and described what Brady had set out in the letter. It was very interesting, he said. Do you mind telling me who had spoken to you about it? And I said, Ian Stewart Brady. There was a pause. I'll forget that I heard that, he said, because with that man comes a circus. What we don't know is whether Brady was trying to concoct a story to make sure that he remained the centre of attention, or whether these things actually happened.
By 1989, Moore's murderers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley had been behind bars for 23 years. Yet their list of crimes continued to multiply. Now Brady was confessing in letters to a journalist to 4 further unsolved murders. These alleged killings were never substantiated by police. By now, nothing Brady said was given any credence whatsoever. By the beginning of the 1990s, he had been diagnosed as clinically insane and transferred to the Ashworth Maximum Security Psychiatric Hospital. Brady despised being in Ashworth, refusing to accept he was insane, and he began a hunger strike to try and force his transfer back to prison.
The process of being on hunger strike, it gives him purpose. So in a rather strange and perverse way, it kind of gives him a sense of control. But all it's actually doing is contributing to his mental deterioration.
Because Ashworth is a hospital, his nurses had the right to force feed him through a tube. Brady claimed he wanted to be returned to the prison system so that he could kill himself by starvation. But some of those who had contact with him during this time were not convinced.
I don't think it was a genuine attempt at all. So I'm seeing him, and he's sitting with a nasogastric tube up his nose. And halfway through the interview, got up and made himself a huge mug of tea and sat back down to continue the interview.
At Greater Manchester Police Headquarters, I'm meeting Martin Bottomley, head of the Moore's Murders Cold Case Unit and responsible for resolving outstanding questions about the killings. His colleagues were some of those who dealt with Brady during his hunger strike.
Police officers visited Brady in Ashworth Hospital, and of course they would talk to the supervising staff there, and they would see in Brady's cell empty Mars bars wrappers. In no way was it a genuine attempt to end his life. It was a stunt. He was playing the system.
As the 21st century dawned, the lives of the Moors murderers were drawing to a close. Myra Hindley was never granted parole, and she died in Durham prison in 2002, aged 60. Just 2 weeks after her death, the law changed, so that now judges and not politicians decide when prisoners should be considered for release. Had she lived, there's every chance she might have been freed. Ian Brady never left Ashworth Secure Hospital. He maintained his so-called hunger strike until he died in 2017. But even after death, the couple continued to exert a powerful hold over the public imagination. Not least because Brady left behind 2 suitcases in which there could be vital clues to their last remaining secret: the location of their third victim, 12-year-old Keith Bennett's grave. After the police failed to find Keith in the 1980s, the Bennett family did not give up hope. Year after year, they kept searching on the moors, helped by legions of volunteers. They even tried reaching out to Myra Hindley.
This is a desperately sad and moving letter from Alan Bennett, the brother of Keith Bennett, writing to Myra Hindley. And in the letter he says, "I do not seek revenge for Keith, and my only wish is to have him found and properly laid to rest." The letter actually ends, "I hope your leg is getting better and you are on the mend in general." That just highlights the lengths to which the family were willing to go to show empathy that they presumably did not feel at all for the person who had killed their relative.
It leaves me on a prayer and a wing again. I've been let down and disappointed that many times. I just can't go with it much longer.
I want to know what chance remains that Keith's grave could still be found. Few are better placed to answer this than John Hunter, a forensic archaeologist. John has studied the terrain of Saddleworth Moor in detail.
The forensic archaeologist, by definition, is a person who is interested in landscape and where buried remains might be, no matter how old they are.
Beginning in the early 1990s, John and his team brought state-of-the-art archaeological techniques to the search for Keith's body, but without success.
We used resistivity, which is a method of passing an electrical current into the ground. We used ground-penetrating radar, and we also did depth profiling. And where we thought there was an anomaly, we began to excavate. And unfortunately, we met a dead end on each one.
Brady had teased the police with a description of the location of Keith's grave, claiming to have used a boulder as a makeshift headstone, but no such location was ever identified. And each year that passes makes the search harder as the landscape of the moors shifts.
It's very much a tussock landscape, and the only place you can realistically bury anybody is in the open peat scars. And what happens, unfortunately, is over time, the grass banks at the top of the open peat slide down and cover the peat further down, but expose peat higher up. What that means is, if you're going to bury someone in an open peat scar in the 1960s, that peat scar may not necessarily still be open in the 1980s or thereafter.
Official police searches ended in 2009, and John's team haven't been back to the moors in over 10 years.
The opportunities for new information coming forward are getting fewer and fewer as time goes on. Is it hard to remain optimistic that Keith Bennett's body will be found?
There are 2 questions. One is he still there? And the answer in my mind is yes. And the second question is there a good chance of him being found? And the answer is probably no.
The only realistic hope of finding Keith's remains would be if some new clue leading to the burial site were to come to light. And there are those who believe they know where such a clue might be hidden. Martin Bottomley, head of the Manchester Police Cold Case Unit, tasked with the continuing search, is following a trail of evidence that is perhaps the last hope of locating Keith Bennett's grave. It's a trail that began with a visit to Brady while he was in Ashworth in 2012.
We received information, credible information, from a lawyer that Brady's mental health advocate had been in possession of an envelope which contained, in her belief, details as to the location of Keith's body. We went to Ashworth Hospital and searched Brady's room at the hospital and all his papers. Brady was there present with two of my female officers, and throughout the search he was continually abusing them, swearing at them. It was a distasteful show, really.
The letter could not be found, but there was something else in the room. 2 locked suitcases that belonged to Brady.
They were large briefcases, obviously containing a lot of material, documents, probably maps, sketches, ramblings, potentially the letter.
Even though he died in 2017, as the law stands, the police are still unable to gain access to Brady's suitcases.
I just think people will be astounded that after 10 years, the police are unable to get access to these things, which may well reveal the whereabouts of Keith Bennett's body.
It's incredibly frustrating. We've tried every method. You know, we've been polite. We've asked for the lawyer to give us access. He's declined. We've applied for search warrants, but the law, as it stands currently, doesn't allow us to give us that power to seize those documents.
But there is hope. New legislation is due to pass through Parliament in 2022 that might finally see those suitcases opened.
There's a bill going through Parliament at the moment which will allow us to apply to a judge where we have reasonable suspicion that there's documents there in someone's possession that might identify the location of human remains, and of course in this case Keith. And if that bill becomes act and becomes law, that will be Keith Bennett's legacy. That will be a done deal so that this doesn't happen to anyone else again.
As a police officer who has dealt with all of Brady's hideous shenanigans over the years, in your heart of hearts, what do you think's in there, Martin?
I think there'll be a lot of ramblings, but I think there'll be maps, there'll be documents. There could be something in there that leads us to a closer location. I'm not saying X marks the spot of Keith's body. It's not a given by any means, but whilst there's a possibility, it's something that we need to do, we've got to do.
Like everyone else, more than anything, I hope that those suitcases might lead to Keith Bennett's body. But there is part of me that worries that those cases represent Ian Brady's final manipulative twist of the knife from beyond the grave.
Do you have any inkling about what might be in those cases?
If I was a betting man, I would put my money on there's nothing of any great value whatsoever. Of course, there's always the hope there is, isn't there? And that's what it's all about. And this is the arch manipulator manipulating from beyond the grave.
Whether those suitcases do turn out to be the key to Keith Bennett's location, or they're Ian Brady's last twisted trick, only time will tell. But every letter, every report, and every photograph I've seen on this journey tells me that this dark tale is a long way from being over.
The story of the Moors murders is one that simply refuses to go away. It didn't end when the killers were both apprehended and imprisoned. It didn't end when both of the killers were dead. Perhaps, if and when those suitcases are open, we can finally close the book on Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. They've had more than enough time in the spotlight.